Tonight, we're stepping into the marble halls and shadowy alleyways of ancient Rome. But this isn't the sanitized version you learned about in school. We're talking about something that Hollywood glosses over, that textbooks awkwardly skip past, and that most documentaries treat with kid gloves. We're talking about sex in ancient Rome, and trust me, you wouldn't last a day in their world. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together to explore these uncomfortable truths from history. And if you enjoy this kind of unflinching look at the past, consider hitting that subscribe button. We're going to need each other for this journey. Now dim the lights if you can, maybe grab a drink, and let's travel back to a time when the rules of intimacy, desire, and human connection were so alien to our modern world that they'd shock you to your core. Picture this. You're walking through the streets of Rome at the height of the empire, around 100 AD. The marble gleams white in the Mediterranean sun, the forums buzz with merchants and politicians, and everywhere you look, there are reminders of Rome's power and sophistication. But beneath that polished surface lies a sexual culture so raw, so unforgiving, and so utterly different from anything we know today that it would leave most modern people reeling. The Romans didn't just have different attitudes about sex, they had an entirely different framework for understanding human desire, power, and what it meant to be a person. And here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. In Roman society, your sexual life wasn't about love, romance, or even pleasure in the way we understand it. It was about power, status, and survival. And if you were on the wrong side of that equation, well, let's just say you'd quickly learn why I titled this video the way I did. See, we're going to uncover the brutal realities that defined intimate life in ancient Rome. We'll explore how social class determined not just who you could be with, but what you could do with them. We'll dive into the shocking legal frameworks that govern sexuality, the religious rituals that would make your skin crawl, and the everyday practices that were so normalized back then that Romans wouldn't even blink at things that would traumatize us today. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. I've spent months researching this topic, digging through ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and modern scholarly work to bring you the most accurate picture possible. This isn't some surface-level overview. We're going deep, and we're going to examine primary sources that most people never get to see. Ancient graffiti, legal documents, medical texts, and personal letters that reveal the raw truth about what it was really like to live in this world. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why the phrase, "when in Rome," takes on a completely different meaning when you know what Romans actually did behind closed doors. Let's start with something that'll immediately show you how different this world was. In ancient Rome, there was no concept of sexual orientation as we understand it today. None. The categories of straight, gay, or bisexual simply didn't exist in Roman minds. Instead, Romans organized sexuality around one simple, brutal principle: dominance and submission. You were either the one doing the penetrating, or you were the one being penetrated. And that distinction didn't just affect your sex life, it determined your entire social standing, your legal rights, and in many cases, whether you lived or died. If you were a Roman citizen, a free man, you were expected to be the dominant partner in any sexual encounter. Always. It didn't matter if your partner was male or female, slave or free, young or old. What mattered was that you maintained your dominance. Being penetrated in any way was seen as fundamentally incompatible with being a Roman man. It was emasculating, degrading, and socially catastrophic. Now here's where it gets really dark. This wasn't just a cultural preference or a social norm. This was backed by law, enforced by violence, and woven into the very fabric of Roman society. The law called it Stuprum, and it was one of the most serious crimes you could commit. But here's the twist that'll make your head spin. Stuprum wasn't about protecting people from sexual violence. It was about protecting the social order from sexual chaos. Let me give you an example that'll illustrate just how twisted this system was. If a Roman citizen was caught in a passive sexual role with another man, both participants could be prosecuted. But the penalties were completely different. The free Roman citizen who had been penetrated could face exile, loss of citizenship, or even death, his crime allowing himself to be feminized. The other man, the one doing the penetrating, might face a much lighter sentence, or sometimes no punishment at all, depending on the circumstances. But it gets worse, much worse, because Roman law didn't just regulate sex between citizens. It created an entire class of people who existed specifically to satisfy the sexual desires of Roman men without threatening the social order. These were slaves, and their sexual exploitation was not only legal, it was expected, normalized, and in many cases, profitable. Roman slavery was different from what most people imagine. It wasn't just about manual labor or domestic service. Sexual slavery was a massive, organized industry that touched every level of Roman society. Wealthy Romans owned personal sex slaves, brothels operated openly throughout the empire, and the sexual use of slaves was considered as normal as owning a horse or a piece of furniture. And here's something that'll really disturb you. Age wasn't a barrier. Roman law set the age of consent at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but that was only for free citizens. Slaves had no age of consent because slaves had no legal personhood. They were property, and property couldn't consent or refuse. The sexual exploitation of children was happening on a massive scale, and it was completely legal. The Romans even had a term for it. They called young male slaves who were used sexually delicia, which literally means delights. These children, often beautiful boys captured in military campaigns or born into slavery, were prized possessions among the Roman elite. They were dressed in fine clothes, given education, and treated as luxury items. But make no mistake about what their primary function was. One Roman writer, Martial, wrote dozens of poems about his sexual encounters with slaves, including children. He wasn't being scandalous or transgressive. He was writing about his normal, everyday life. These poems were popular entertainment, read at dinner parties and shared among friends. What we would consider horrific crimes were, to them, just Tuesday. But let's talk about what happened to free Roman women, because their situation was almost as brutal, just in different ways. Roman women existed in a bizarre liminal space where they had more freedom than women in many other ancient cultures, but their sexuality was still completely controlled by men. A Roman woman's sexual choices could literally determine the fate of her entire family. For unmarried Roman women, virginity wasn't just expected, it was legally enforced. The penalty for losing your virginity outside of marriage could be death, and not just for you, but for your sexual partner as well. But here's the catch. This law only applied to women of certain social classes. If you were a slave, a prostitute, or from a lower class family, you had no legal protection at all. Anyone could do anything to you, and there was no recourse. Marriage didn't necessarily make things better. Roman wives were expected to be sexually available to their husbands at all times, for any purpose. Refusal could be grounds for divorce. And in a Roman divorce, the woman lost everything. Her children, her property, her social standing, everything. She'd be sent back to her father's house in disgrace, if her father would even take her back. But Roman husbands had no such restrictions. They could sleep with slaves, visit prostitutes, maintain long-term relationships with other men, and even have sex with other men's wives, as long as they maintained their dominant role. The sexual double standard wasn't just unfair, it was legally codified and socially enforced. And speaking of prostitution, let's talk about what that industry actually looked like, because it's nothing like what you might imagine. Roman brothels weren't hidden away in dark corners or run by criminal organizations. They were legal businesses, regulated by the state and taxed like any other commercial enterprise. The government literally profited from sexual exploitation. The largest brothel in Pompeii, preserved by volcanic ash, gives us a perfect window into this world. It was a 2-story building with 10 small rooms, each barely large enough for a bed. The walls were covered with explicit frescoes showing different sexual positions, essentially serving as a menu for customers who might not speak Latin. Graffiti left by customers covers the walls, with reviews of individual prostitutes and descriptions of sexual acts that would make modern adults blush. But here's what really shows you how normalized this was. The brothel was located right in the city center, next to shops, restaurants, and other businesses. Families walked past it every day. Children played in the streets outside. It was just part of the urban landscape, as unremarkable as a bakery or a blacksmith shop. The women working there were almost exclusively slaves or former slaves. They had no choice in their profession, no ability to refuse customers, and no legal protection from violence or abuse. They were property, and like all property, they could be bought, sold, rented, or destroyed at their owner's whim. And the customers? They were everyone: married men, unmarried men, teenagers, elderly men, politicians, soldiers, merchants, craftsmen. Using prostitutes wasn't seen as cheating on your wife or being unfaithful. It was seen as normal male behavior like eating or drinking. Roman wives were expected to tolerate it, and many even encouraged it, seeing it as a way to reduce sexual demands on themselves. But what really shows you how different Roman sexual culture was from ours is what happened during their religious festivals. Romans had dozens of gods and goddesses associated with sexuality, fertility, and reproduction. And the rituals dedicated to these deities were unlike anything you'd see in a modern religious context. The Festival of Liberalia, dedicated to the god Liber, involved massive public celebrations where sexual acts were performed openly in the streets. The Festival of Floralia included naked actresses performing sexual acts on stage in front of crowds that included children and families. The Lupercalia, one of Rome's oldest festivals, involved naked men running through the streets, whipping women with leather thongs made from sacrificed goats. Women would actually line up to be whipped, believing it would help them conceive. These weren't fringe practices or underground cults. These were official state religions endorsed by the government and participated in by the highest levels of society. The emperor himself would often attend these festivals and participate in the rituals. Now you might be wondering, didn't anyone object to this? Didn't anyone think this was wrong? The answer is complicated because Roman morality was so different from ours that the things they worried about weren't the things we worry about. Romans did have moral concerns about sexuality, but they were focused on maintaining social order, not protecting individual rights or dignity. They worried about adultery, but only when it involved free Roman women. They worried about rape, but only when it violated property rights. They worried about sexual excess, but only when it made men weak or distracted them from their duties to the state. The philosopher Seneca wrote extensively about sexual morality, but his concerns were about self-control and moderation, not about consent or human dignity. He worried that too much sexual indulgence would make Roman men soft and weak, unable to fulfill their roles as soldiers and citizens. He didn't worry about the slaves being exploited because in his worldview, slaves weren't fully human. Even the early Christians, who did oppose many Roman sexual practices, focused their criticism on adultery and sexual excess rather than on slavery or the exploitation of the powerless. Christianity eventually transformed Roman sexual culture, but it took centuries, and even then, many of the fundamental power imbalances remained. What's really striking is how all of this was justified through Roman law and philosophy. The Romans weren't monsters who enjoyed cruelty for its own sake. They were people who had constructed an entire intellectual framework that made these practices seem not just acceptable, but necessary for the functioning of society. Roman legal scholars wrote extensively about sexual crimes, but their focus was always on protecting the social hierarchy, not individual rights. Roman philosophers discussed the nature of desire and pleasure, but within a framework that assumed some people were naturally dominant and others naturally submissive. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Roman sexual culture, how it shaped the way people thought about their own desires and identities. If you were a Roman slave, you weren't just physically powerless, you were psychologically conditioned to see your own exploitation as natural and inevitable. If you were a Roman woman, you weren't just legally restricted, you were taught to see your own desires as dangerous and shameful. The Romans created a system where the people being exploited often participated in their own exploitation, not because they enjoyed it, but because they had no framework for understanding that things could be different. It's a level of psychological control that's almost impossible for us to comprehend today. And this is where we start to see why you, as a modern person, wouldn't survive in this world. It's not just that the practices were different or that the laws were harsher. It's that the entire way of thinking about human sexuality, dignity, and relationships was so alien to everything we believe today that you'd be constantly horrified, confused, and probably in danger. If you were transported back to ancient Rome tomorrow, you'd find yourself in a world where your most basic assumptions about human relationships, consent, and dignity were not just rejected, but incomprehensible to the people around you. You'd be like someone trying to explain color to people who had only ever seen in black and white. But here's what makes this story even more complex. The Romans weren't uniquely evil or depraved. They were people, just like us, who had created a society that normalized and systematized sexual exploitation. And that should terrify us because it shows how easy it is for any society to lose its way when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable among us. The Romans thought they were civilized. They thought they were the pinnacle of human achievement. They had art, literature, philosophy, law, architecture, and engineering that we still admire today. But they also had a sexual culture that was built on the systematic exploitation of the powerless, and they saw no contradiction between these two things. And that's the real lesson of Roman sexuality. It's not enough to build beautiful buildings or write elegant poetry. A civilization is ultimately judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members. And by that measure, Rome was a failure of the highest order. But we're just getting started. In the next part of this series, we're going to dive even deeper into the specific practices that defined Roman sexual culture. We'll explore the role of the military in spreading these practices throughout the empire, the impact of different religious cults on sexual behavior, and the gradual transformation of Roman sexuality as the empire evolved and eventually fell. We'll also look at some of the individual stories, the personal accounts and archaeological evidence that show us what life was really like for ordinary people caught up in this system. Because behind all the laws and social structures were real people, real lives, and real suffering that we can't ignore or forget. So if you're ready to continue this journey into one of history's most complex and disturbing topics, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. This is going to be a series that challenges everything you think you know about the ancient world, and I promise you, we're just scratching the surface of how deep this rabbit hole goes. But there's something even more disturbing we need to talk about, something that shows just how deeply this system penetrated every aspect of Roman life. Let's talk about what happened to children in this world, because this is where the true horror of Roman sexual culture becomes undeniable. Roman children weren't protected by our modern concepts of childhood innocence or developmental psychology. They were seen as miniature adults, and their sexual exploitation wasn't just tolerated, it was institutionalized. We're talking about a society where the sexual abuse of children was so normalized that parents would actually sell their own children into sexual slavery to pay off debts. The practice was called Nexum, and it was perfectly legal. If a Roman citizen couldn't pay what they owed, they could offer their children as collateral. These children would then become the property of the creditor, who could use them however they wanted. And what they wanted was often sexual service. Now, I know this is hard to hear, but we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with here. Roman literature is filled with casual references to the sexual use of children. The poet Catullus wrote about his desire for a young slave boy with the same tone he'd used to describe wanting a particular wine. The historian Suetonius described emperors who collected children for sexual purposes like other people might collect coins or artwork. Emperor Tiberius was notorious for this. He had a private island, Capri, where he kept groups of children for his sexual pleasure. Suetonius describes in detail how Tiberius would train these children in sexual techniques, how he'd watch them perform sexual acts with each other, and how he'd use them himself. And this wasn't scandalous gossip, this was recorded history, written by respected historians who saw nothing particularly unusual about it. But here's what really shows you how normalized this was. These weren't hidden crimes or secret perversions. These were public behaviors that everyone knew about. Senators would visit Tiberius on Capri. Wealthy Romans would compete to provide him with new children. The whole Roman elite was complicit in what we would recognize today as a massive child trafficking operation. And it wasn't just emperors. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii shows that child prostitution was common throughout the city. Brothels had special rooms designed for children. Graffiti on walls advertises the services of boys and girls who couldn't have been older than 10 or 12. Price lists carved into stone show that children were actually more expensive than adult prostitutes. because their youth made them more desirable. The Roman legal system reinforced all of this. The age of consent laws I mentioned earlier weren't designed to protect children. They were designed to protect the property rights of fathers. If someone had sex with your daughter without your permission, they hadn't committed a crime against her. They'd committed a crime against you. She was your property, and they damaged your goods. But if you gave permission, or if you sold your daughter into slavery, then there was no crime at all. The law didn't recognize children as having their own rights or interests. They were objects to be owned, traded, and used. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Roman sexuality, the complete absence of any concept of consent as we understand it today. In Roman thinking, consent wasn't about whether someone wanted to have sex, it was about whether they had the legal right to refuse. And most people didn't have that right. Slaves couldn't refuse their masters, children couldn't refuse adults, wives couldn't refuse their husbands, lower-class women couldn't refuse upper-class men. The entire system was built on the assumption that most people existed for the sexual pleasure of a small group of powerful men. And here's where it gets really twisted. The Romans actually developed elaborate philosophical justifications for this system. They argued that some people were naturally born to be slaves, that women were naturally inferior to men, that children needed to be taught their place in society through sexual submission. They turned exploitation into a moral virtue. The philosopher Aristotle, whose ideas heavily influenced Roman thinking, argued that slavery was natural and beneficial for both master and slave. He claimed that some people were born with the souls of slaves, and that forcing them into submission was actually doing them a favor. Roman thinkers took these ideas and applied them specifically to sexual relationships. They developed the concept of natural sexual roles based on social class, age, and gender. If you were born a slave, it was natural for you to be sexually submissive. If you were born a woman, it was natural for you to serve men's desires. If you were born into the lower classes, it was natural for you to be available to your social superiors. This wasn't just practical exploitation, it was ideological domination. The Romans didn't just control people's bodies, they controlled their minds, making them believe that their exploitation was natural, inevitable, and even morally correct. And the results were devastating. We have surviving letters from Roman slaves begging their masters for mercy, not because they were being overworked, but because they were being sexually abused. We have medical texts describing injuries that could only have come from violent sexual assault. We have legal cases where slaves tried to kill themselves rather than submit to their master's sexual demands. But perhaps most disturbing of all, we have evidence that many victims of this system eventually internalized it so completely that they began to participate in exploiting others. Freed slaves who gained their freedom would often acquire slaves of their own and treat them the same way they had been treated. The cycle of abuse became self-perpetuating. This is what I mean when I say you wouldn't survive in this world. It's not just that you'd be horrified by what you saw. It's that the entire framework of thinking about human relationships was so alien to everything we believe today that you'd be psychologically unable to function. Imagine trying to explain to a Roman that children have rights, that consent matters, that slavery is wrong. They wouldn't just disagree with you, they literally wouldn't understand what you were talking about. It would be like trying to explain quantum physics to someone who'd never heard of atoms. But let's dig deeper into how this system actually worked in practice, because understanding the mechanics of Roman sexual exploitation helps us see how societies can normalize the unthinkable. The Roman economy was built on what historians call sexual surplus extraction. This means that a significant portion of the empire's wealth came from the sexual exploitation of slaves and lower-class women. Brothels were major businesses that employed thousands of people and generated enormous profits. The sex trade was so important to the Roman economy that the government created special taxes just for prostitutes. These taxes weren't punishment, they were revenue generation. The Roman state literally profited from sexual exploitation. Tax collectors would visit brothels regularly, counting the number of prostitutes and calculating how much the owners owed. The more women and children being exploited, the more money the government made, and this created a perverse incentive system where local officials actually encouraged the expansion of the sex trade. Cities competed to have the largest and most profitable brothels. Military commanders would capture women and children specifically to stock brothels in newly conquered territories. The Roman military machine and the Roman sex trade were intimately connected. When Roman armies conquered new territories, one of the first things they'd do was establish brothels for the soldiers. These weren't just for entertainment, they were seen as essential for maintaining military morale and preventing soldiers from raping local women, which might cause political problems. But here's the twisted logic. It was considered wrong for soldiers to rape free women from conquered territories because that might provoke rebellion. But it was perfectly acceptable to enslave those same women and force them into prostitution because then the rape became a commercial transaction. The Romans literally created a system where rape was illegal, but forced prostitution was not only legal, but encouraged. They solved the problem of sexual violence by institutionalizing it and making it profitable. This system was so pervasive that it shaped the physical layout of Roman cities. Brothels weren't hidden away in red light districts, they were integrated into the urban fabric. In Pompeii, archaeologists have found brothels next to bakeries, taverns, and even temples. The famous phallus symbols carved into Pompeii's streets weren't just decorative, they were directional signs pointing toward brothels. The Romans were so casual about commercialized sexual exploitation that they advertised it publicly. We have surviving advertisements for brothels painted on walls, mosaics in public baths showing sexual acts, and even official government documents regulating the sex trade. But what's really chilling is how this system affected the psychology of everyone involved. We have surviving letters from Roman men discussing their sexual encounters with slaves and prostitutes, and the language they use is identical to how they describe buying livestock or furniture. There's no recognition that they're dealing with human beings who might have feelings, desires, or suffering. One Roman writer, Petronius, wrote an entire novel called The Satyricon that describes the sexual adventures of young Roman men. The book is filled with scenes of sexual violence, exploitation of slaves, and abuse of children, but it's written as a comedy. The suffering of the victims is treated as entertainment, and this wasn't considered edgy or controversial literature. It was mainstream entertainment, read at dinner parties and quoted in polite society. The sexual exploitation of the powerless was so normalized that it became a source of humor. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how this system affected the victims themselves. We have evidence that many people who were sexually exploited in Rome developed what we'd now recognize as complex trauma responses. They'd become emotionally numb, unable to form healthy relationships, or would develop elaborate psychological defenses to survive their daily reality. Some would dissociate during sexual encounters, mentally separating themselves from what was happening to their bodies. Others would develop what psychologists call learned helplessness, becoming so passive and compliant that they'd stop resisting even when resistance might be possible. Many would internalize the Romans' ideological justifications for their exploitation, convincing themselves that they deserved what was happening to them, or that it was natural and inevitable. The psychological damage was often as severe as the physical abuse. And here's where we see the true evil of the Roman system. It wasn't just about sexual gratification for the powerful. It was about psychological domination, about breaking people so completely that they'd lose the ability to even imagine freedom or dignity. The Romans understood that if you can control someone's sexuality, you can control their entire identity. Sexual exploitation wasn't just a byproduct of Roman society, it was one of the primary mechanisms through which social control was maintained. This is why Roman sexual culture was so different from other ancient civilizations. The Greeks had slavery and sexual exploitation too, but they also had philosophical traditions that at least acknowledged the humanity of slaves and women. The Romans systematically eliminated those traditions and replaced them with an ideology that justified unlimited exploitation. They created what historians call a rape culture, in the truest sense of the term. Not just a culture where rape was common, but a culture where rape was seen as natural, inevitable, and even morally correct under certain circumstances. And this culture was exported throughout the Roman Empire. As Roman armies conquered new territories, they brought their sexual practices with them. Local cultures that might have had different attitudes toward sexuality were systematically destroyed and replaced with Roman norms. We have evidence of this cultural transformation from across the empire. In Gaul, Britain, Spain, and North Africa, archaeological evidence shows that Roman-style brothels and sexual practices were imposed on local populations. The Romans didn't just conquer territory, they conquered sexuality itself. But here's what makes this story even more complex. Not everyone in Roman society accepted this system. We have evidence of resistance of people who tried to protect the vulnerable or who developed alternative sexual ethics. Some Roman women formed secret societies to help other women escape abusive marriages. Some slaves organized networks to protect children from sexual exploitation. Some philosophers and writers, particularly in the later empire, began to question the morality of slavery and sexual exploitation. But these were exceptions, and they were often brutally suppressed. The Roman state had too much invested in sexual exploitation to allow serious challenges to the system. And this brings us to one of the most important questions we can ask about Roman sexuality. How did this system finally end? Because it did end eventually. The sexual culture of late Rome was very different from the sexual culture of early Rome, and understanding that transformation can teach us something about how societies can change. The answer is complicated, but it involves the rise of Christianity, the economic decline of the empire, and the gradual development of new ideas about human dignity and rights. But that transformation took centuries, and it was incomplete. Many aspects of Roman sexual culture survived long after the empire fell, and some of their influence can still be seen in modern societies. But that's a story for another part of this series. Right now, I want you to sit with what we've discussed, because it's a lot to process. We've covered the systematic sexual exploitation of children, the institutionalization of rape, the psychological manipulation of victims, and the economic incentives that made it all possible. This isn't just ancient history. These are patterns of exploitation that we can see in different forms throughout human history, including in our own time. Understanding how the Romans normalized the unthinkable can help us recognize when our own societies are heading down similar paths. Because the Romans weren't monsters. They were people, just like us, who created a system that turned exploitation into virtue and suffering into entertainment. And if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. That's why this history matters. That's why we need to remember not just the marble columns and the eloquent speeches, but also the broken bodies and the silenced voices. Because a civilization that forgets its capacity for evil is a civilization that's doomed to repeat it. In our next installment, we're going to explore how Roman sexual practices affected different social classes, how the military spread these practices throughout the empire, and how individual Romans navigated this system in their daily lives. We'll also look at some of the specific archaeological evidence that gives us insight into what life was really like for ordinary people caught up in this system. So make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because this journey into the dark heart of Roman sexuality is far from over. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by what we've covered today, that's normal. This is heavy material, and it's supposed to be disturbing, because sometimes the only way to honor the victims of history is to refuse to look away from their suffering. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that understanding the past isn't just about satisfying curiosity, it's about making sure that we never forget the price of turning away when the vulnerable need protection. But there's another layer to this story that we need to examine, something that reveals just how deeply this system penetrated Roman consciousness. We need to talk about Roman marriage because even this most sacred institution was warped by the sexual power dynamics we've been exploring. Roman marriage wasn't about love or companionship as we understand it today. It was a business transaction, a political alliance, and a breeding arrangement all rolled into one. And the sexual expectations within marriage were so alien to our modern understanding that they'd leave most people speechless. Let's start with how Roman marriages were arranged. If you were a Roman girl, your father would begin negotiating your marriage when you were around 10 years old. Not planning for when you'd be older, negotiating for immediate marriage. The legal minimum age was 12, but many girls were married even younger through special arrangements. Your husband might be 40, 50, or even 60 years older than you. Age wasn't just irrelevant, it was actually preferred. Older men were seen as more stable, more experienced, and better able to control their young wives. The Romans had a saying, "The best wife is one who is young enough to be shaped by her husband's will." But here's what really shows you how different this world was. Roman wives had no legal right to refuse sex with their husbands. None. The concept didn't exist. A husband could demand sexual access at any time, in any way, for any reason. And if a wife refused, she could be divorced instantly, losing her children, her property, and her social standing. One Roman legal text, the Digest of Justinian, explicitly states that a wife who denies her husband's sexual demands has abandoned her marital duties and can be cast out without cause. This wasn't just social pressure, it was legal requirement. Roman wives were essentially sexual slaves with better living conditions. But it gets worse. Roman husbands had the legal right to share their wives with other men. If a husband wanted to cement a business relationship or political alliance, he could offer his wife sexual services as part of the deal. The wife had no say in the matter, she was property, and property could be lent, traded, or given away. We have surviving letters from Roman men discussing these arrangements with the same casual tone they'd used to discuss lending a horse or a piece of furniture. One letter from a Roman senator to his business partner reads, "My wife is at your disposal for the duration of your visit. Use her as you see fit, and we'll consider our arrangement sealed." The recipient of this letter wrote back thanking him for his generosity and describing in detail what he planned to do with the senator's wife. These weren't criminal conspiracies or secret perversions. These were normal business communications between respectable Roman citizens. And what happened to the wives in these situations? They were expected to submit gracefully, to treat their sexual exploitation as an honor, and to never speak of it afterward. Roman literature is filled with praise for wives who endured these arrangements without complaint. The poet Ovid wrote admiringly about a woman who gave herself to her husband's friends with such grace that they praised her virtue as much as her beauty. The historian Livy described wives who served their husbands' political ambitions with their bodies as examples of Roman feminine virtue. But perhaps most disturbing of all is what happened to Roman wives who became pregnant during these arrangements. If a wife gave birth to a child who obviously wasn't her husband's, the husband had the legal right to kill both the wife and the child. This wasn't considered murder, it was considered justified enforcement of property rights. The law called it patria potestas, the power of the father, and it extended to every aspect of family life. A Roman father had absolute authority over his wife, his children, and even his adult sons. He could kill them, sell them, or give them away without any legal consequences. This power was so absolute that Roman fathers would regularly kill newborn children they didn't want to raise. Not just disabled children or children born from adultery, but healthy babies whose only crime was being born at an inconvenient time. The practice was called exposure, and it was so common that abandoned babies were a regular feature of Roman city life. Most of these exposed children were girls because girls were seen as less valuable than boys. They couldn't carry on the family name, they couldn't inherit property, and they required expensive dowries to marry off. Many Roman families would keep one or two daughters and expose the rest. But here's the truly chilling part. Many of these exposed children didn't die. They were collected by slave traders who would raise them specifically for sexual exploitation. The Romans created a system where unwanted children were systematically funneled into the sex trade. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Roman Empire shows that this practice was enormous in scale. We've found mass graves containing thousands of infant skeletons, most of them female. We've found documents from slave markets listing children by age, appearance, and sexual training. We've found contracts for the sale of children as young as 5 or 6 years old. The Romans didn't just tolerate child sexual exploitation, they created an entire economic system designed to produce it. Unwanted children were turned into commodities, and those commodities were consumed by a society that saw nothing wrong with the sexual use of the powerless. Now let's talk about what this meant for the children who survived this system, because understanding their experiences helps us grasp the full horror of what we're dealing with here. Roman children who were sexually exploited from an early age developed what we'd now recognize as severe psychological trauma. But they had no framework for understanding what was happening to them, no language to describe their suffering, and no hope of escape or justice. Many would develop what psychologists call complex PTSD, a condition where the victim's entire personality becomes organized around survival in an abusive environment. They'd become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats. They'd develop an exaggerated startle response, jumping at sudden noises or movements. They'd have difficulty forming attachments to other people because attachment had always meant danger. But perhaps most tragically, many would develop what's called trauma bonding with their abusers. They'd become emotionally dependent on the very people who were hurting them because those people were also their only source of food, shelter, and protection. We have surviving accounts from Roman writers describing slaves who would become deeply attached to masters who sexually abused them. These accounts are often written in a tone of admiration, praising the slave's loyalty and devotion. But what they're really describing is the psychological damage that comes from having no other choice but to love your abuser. The Romans interpreted this trauma bonding as evidence that slaves were naturally suited for submission. They used the psychological damage they'd inflicted as proof that their victims deserved their treatment. It's a level of psychological manipulation that's almost impossible to comprehend. But let's step back for a moment and talk about how all of this affected Roman society as a whole. Because a culture that normalizes sexual exploitation doesn't just harm the direct victims, it warps the entire social fabric in ways that ultimately destroy the civilization itself. The Romans created what historians call a culture of sexual violence. This wasn't just a society where sexual violence was common, it was a society where sexual violence was seen as natural, inevitable, and even beneficial. And this culture shaped every aspect of Roman life, from politics to religion to art. Roman politics, for example, was deeply influenced by sexual competition between powerful men. Political alliances were often sealed through sexual arrangements. Political enemies would attack each other by spreading rumors about their sexual practices. Political power was often measured by how many people you could sexually dominate. The Emperor Caligula was notorious for using sexual humiliation as a political weapon. He would force senators to watch while he had sex with their wives. He would make political opponents perform sexual acts in public as a condition of keeping their positions. He would give important government posts to his sexual partners, regardless of their qualifications. This wasn't seen as aberrant behavior by a crazy emperor. It was seen as an extreme example of normal Roman political practice. Power and sexuality were so intertwined in Roman culture that you couldn't separate them. Roman religion was similarly warped by this culture of sexual violence. Many Roman religious ceremonies involved sexual acts, often performed by slaves or children. The Romans worshipped gods who were rapists, and they saw sexual violence as a form of divine worship. The cult of Priapus, for example, centered around a god with an enormous phallus who was said to rape anyone who entered his garden. Romans would place statues of Priapus in their homes and gardens, and they would perform sexual acts in front of these statues as a form of prayer. The festival of Lupercalia involved naked men running through the streets of Rome, whipping women with strips of goatskin. Women would line up to be whipped, believing it would make them fertile. But the whipping was often so severe that women would be left bloody and scarred. The Romans saw this as normal religious practice. They believed that sexual violence was a way of connecting with the divine, of channeling the chaotic forces of nature into their civilized world. Roman art was similarly influenced by this culture. Roman homes were decorated with frescoes showing sexual violence. Roman literature was filled with stories of rape and sexual exploitation. Roman theater featured plays where sexual assault was treated as comedy. The Romans created an entire aesthetic around sexual violence. They turned the suffering of the powerless into entertainment, into decoration, into art. They made beauty out of brutality, and they called it civilization. But here's what's really chilling. The Romans didn't see any contradiction between their sexual practices and their claims to moral superiority. They genuinely believed that their treatment of slaves, women, and children was evidence of their advanced civilization. Roman philosophers argued that sexual exploitation was necessary for social order. Roman lawyers argued that sexual violence was justified by natural law. Roman historians argued that sexual domination was proof of Roman virtue. They created an entire intellectual framework that turned exploitation into virtue, suffering into entertainment, and domination into justice. They didn't just practice sexual violence, they celebrated it, theorized about it, and exported it throughout their empire. And this brings us to one of the most important questions we can ask about Roman sexuality. How did ordinary Romans live with themselves? How did they participate in this system without being overwhelmed by guilt or horror? The answer is that they developed what psychologists call moral disengagement. They used a variety of psychological mechanisms to avoid confronting the reality of what they were doing. Some Romans would use euphemistic language to describe sexual exploitation. They'd call rape correction or discipline. They'd call child sexual abuse education or training. They'd call forced prostitution service or duty. Others would focus on the supposed benefits of sexual exploitation. They'd argue that slaves were better off being sexually used than being killed. They'd claim that children learned valuable skills through sexual abuse. They'd insist that prostitutes were providing an important social service. Still, others would dehumanize their victims. They'd convince themselves that slaves weren't really human, that children didn't have real feelings, that women were naturally inferior. They'd create elaborate theories about why some people deserve to be exploited. But perhaps most commonly, Romans would simply refuse to think about the consequences of their actions. They'd focus on their immediate pleasure or profit and ignore the suffering they were causing. They'd treat sexual exploitation as a routine business transaction and avoid any deeper moral reflection. This moral disengagement was so complete that many Romans genuinely believed they were living in a moral and just society. They saw their sexual practices as evidence of their sophistication and refinement. They pitied other cultures that didn't have access to the same pleasures they enjoyed. The Romans created a system of sexual exploitation so total and so normalized that even the perpetrators couldn't see it for what it was. They were trapped in their own ideology, unable to recognize the horror they were creating. And this is what makes Roman sexuality so disturbing to contemplate. It wasn't just a system of exploitation, it was a system of self-deception. The Romans didn't just hurt other people, they lost their own humanity in the process. But there's one more aspect of this story that we need to examine, something that shows just how deeply this system affected every level of Roman society. We need to talk about what happened to Roman men who tried to resist or escape these sexual expectations. Because the Roman system of sexual domination didn't just oppress women, children, and slaves, it also trapped free Roman men in a rigid system of sexual performance that many found impossible to maintain. Roman men were expected to be sexually dominant in all situations. They were expected to be constantly ready for sex, constantly aggressive, constantly in control. They were expected to use their sexual power to maintain their social position and to demonstrate their worth as Roman citizens. But many Roman men couldn't or wouldn't live up to these expectations. Some were naturally gentle or passive. Some were attracted to other men but didn't want to be in the dominant role. Some were simply tired of the constant pressure to perform sexually. These men faced a terrible choice: participate in a system they found morally repugnant or face social destruction. Because in Roman society, a man who didn't sexually dominate others was seen as weak, effeminate, and unworthy of citizenship. We have surviving letters from Roman men describing their struggles with these expectations. One letter from a Roman soldier to his brother reads, "I cannot bring myself to use the captives as the other men do. Their cries haunt my dreams, but if I do not, the men will think me weak, and I will lose their respect." Another letter from a Roman merchant to his friend describes his horror at being expected to sexually use his slaves. "I look at them and see my own children. How can I do to them what I would die to prevent being done to my own family? Yet if I do not, I will be seen as unmanly and my business will suffer." These men were trapped in a system that demanded they become monsters in order to maintain their social standing. And many of them were slowly destroyed by the contradiction between their moral instincts and their social expectations. Some Roman men would develop what we'd now recognize as depression or anxiety disorders. They'd become unable to eat or sleep, unable to concentrate on their work, unable to form healthy relationships with their families. Others would turn to alcohol or drugs to numb themselves to what they were doing. Roman literature is filled with references to men who drank themselves to death rather than face the moral consequences of their actions. Still others would become increasingly violent and cruel, as if by escalating their brutality they could somehow silence their own consciences. The system that was supposed to make them powerful instead made them into broken, desperate people. But perhaps most tragically, some Roman men would project their own moral disgust onto their victims. They'd blame the slaves for tempting them, blame the children for being seductive, blame the women for being weak. They'd convince themselves that their victims deserved their treatment because admitting otherwise would mean admitting their own moral failure. This psychological projection was so common that it became embedded in Roman culture. The Romans developed elaborate theories about why their victims were naturally suited for exploitation, why they actually enjoyed their abuse, why they were better off being sexually used than being free. These theories weren't just intellectual exercises, they were psychological defenses. They allowed Roman men to maintain their self-image as moral, civilized people while participating in a system of systematic sexual exploitation. And this brings us to the final, most disturbing aspect of Roman sexuality, how it ultimately destroyed the very people it was supposed to benefit. Because a system based on sexual domination doesn't just harm the victims, it corrupts the perpetrators in ways that ultimately make them incapable of genuine human connection. Roman men who spent their lives sexually dominating others often found themselves unable to form loving relationships with their wives, unable to connect emotionally with their children, unable to experience genuine intimacy with anyone. They'd become so accustomed to seeing other people as objects to be used that they lost the ability to see them as fellow human beings. This emotional numbness became a defining characteristic of Roman elite culture. Roman literature is filled with descriptions of men who felt empty, bored, and disconnected from life. They had unlimited power and unlimited access to sexual pleasure, but they'd lost the ability to find joy or meaning in their lives. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, in his private journal, wrote, "I am surrounded by people, yet I feel utterly alone. I have access to every pleasure, yet nothing brings me satisfaction. I rule the world, yet I feel powerless to change anything that matters." This wasn't just personal depression, it was the inevitable result of a system that turned human relationships into power transactions. When you spend your life treating other people as objects, you eventually lose the ability to experience them as anything else. And this emotional deadness had profound political consequences. Roman leaders who couldn't empathize with their subjects made increasingly cruel and destructive decisions. They'd launch wars not because they were necessary, but because they were bored. They'd impose harsh taxes not because they needed the money, but because they enjoyed the power. The Roman Empire's ultimate collapse wasn't just due to military or economic factors, it was also due to the moral and emotional bankruptcy of its ruling class. A civilization that had lost the ability to value human life and dignity was a civilization that had lost the ability to sustain itself. But here's what makes this story even more relevant to our modern world. The Romans didn't set out to create a system of sexual exploitation. They started with relatively normal sexual practices and gradually normalized increasingly extreme behaviors until they'd created a monster they couldn't control. The process was gradual, incremental, and often rationalized as progress or sophistication. Each generation pushed the boundaries a little further, each new law made exploitation a little more legal, each new practice made cruelty a little more acceptable. By the time they realized what they'd created, it was too late. The system had become so embedded in their culture, their economy, and their psychology that they couldn't change it without destroying everything they thought they were. And that's the real lesson of Roman sexuality for our modern world. It's not that we're in danger of becoming exactly like the Romans, but that we're always in danger of gradually normalizing practices that we'd find horrific if we encountered them suddenly. The Romans show us how easy it is for any society to lose its moral compass, how quickly exploitation can become normalized, and how difficult it is to recognize when you're crossing lines that should never be crossed. They remind us that civilization isn't just about art, literature, law, and technology. It's about how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society. And by that measure, Rome was one of history's greatest failures, despite all its other achievements. In our next installment, we're going to explore how Roman sexual practices evolved over time, how different emperors shaped sexual culture, and how the eventual rise of Christianity began to transform these deeply embedded practices. We'll also look at some of the archaeological evidence that shows us what daily life was really like for ordinary Romans caught up in this system. But before we end this part of our journey, I want you to think about what we've covered today. We've explored systematic sexual exploitation, the normalization of cruelty, and the psychological mechanisms that allowed people to participate in their own moral destruction. This isn't just ancient history. These are patterns that we can see in different forms throughout human history, including in our own time. Understanding how the Romans lost their way can help us recognize when our own societies are heading down dangerous paths, because the Romans weren't uniquely evil. They were people, just like us, who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but that ultimately led them into moral darkness. And if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. That's why we study this history. Not to judge the past, but to learn from it. Not to feel superior to our ancestors, but to understand our own capacity for both good and evil. And not to despair about human nature, but to commit ourselves to building societies that protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. So make sure you're subscribed and ready for the next part of this series, because we're going to dive even deeper into this complex and disturbing topic. And remember, understanding the darkness of the past is the first step toward ensuring it never happens again. The gradual transformation of Roman sexual culture didn't happen overnight, and understanding how it evolved gives us crucial insight into how societies can slowly drift toward accepting the unacceptable. What we're about to explore shows how emperors, laws, and social pressures combined to create an environment where sexual exploitation became not just tolerated, but celebrated. Let's start with how different emperors shaped Roman sexual culture, because the man at the top of the empire had enormous influence on what was considered acceptable behavior throughout society. And some of these emperors took Roman sexual practices to extremes that would shock even other Romans. Emperor Caligula, who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, turned sexual domination into a form of political theater. He didn't just abuse his power sexually, he made sexual humiliation a cornerstone of his governing strategy. Caligula would force senators to bring their wives to palace dinners, where he would openly evaluate their sexual attractiveness and sometimes take them to his private chambers while their husbands waited outside. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Caligula would then return to the dinner and describe in detail what he'd done with these women, rating their performance and comparing them to previous conquests. The senators were forced to sit there and listen because showing any displeasure could result in execution. One surviving account describes a dinner where Caligula announced that he was going to have sex with every senator's wife before the evening ended. He then proceeded to do exactly that, while their husbands continued eating and making polite conversation. The account describes this as an example of Caligula's divine power and his ability to do whatever he wanted. This wasn't just personal perversion, it was systematic psychological warfare. Caligula understood that by sexually humiliating the most powerful men in the empire, he could break their will to resist him. He was using sex as a weapon of political control. Emperor Nero took this even further. He not only abused his position sexually, he actually tried to legalize practices that even most Romans found disturbing. Nero passed laws that made it legal for emperors to marry anyone they wanted, regardless of that person's age, gender, or family relationship. Nero used this law to marry a young boy named Sporus, whom he had castrated so he could play the role of a wife. But Nero didn't stop there. He also married his own mother, Agrippina, in a ceremony that was attended by senators and other high-ranking officials. The marriage was consummated publicly as part of the wedding celebration. These weren't secret perversions or private scandals. These were public ceremonies recorded by official historians and attended by the most important people in the empire. Nero was using the emperor's absolute power to normalize practices that would have been unthinkable under previous rulers. But what's really chilling is how Roman society adapted to these new standards. Within a few years of Nero's reign, practices that had once been considered abhorrent became fashionable among the elite. Wealthy Romans began imitating the emperor's behavior, marrying their own relatives and abusing children more openly. The Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, created what historians call the institutionalization of sexual terror. He established a network of informants who would report on the sexual activities of Roman citizens. But these informants weren't looking for illegal activities. They were looking for people who weren't being sexually aggressive enough. Domitian believed that Romans who didn't regularly demonstrate their sexual dominance were potential threats to the empire. He created a system where citizens were expected to publicly prove their sexual prowess, and those who failed to do so could lose their property, their citizenship, or their lives. Roman men were required to keep detailed records of their sexual conquests. They had to document how many slaves they'd used, how many prostitutes they'd visited, and how many free women they'd seduced. These records were reviewed by government officials, and men who didn't meet certain quotas could face punishment. But here's where it gets truly twisted. Domitian also created rewards for sexual aggression. Romans who demonstrated exceptional sexual domination could receive tax breaks, government positions, and even cash payments. The empire was literally paying its citizens to sexually exploit others. This system created a culture of competitive sexual violence. Roman men would compete to see who could abuse the most people, who could devise the most creative forms of sexual torture, and who could break the most victims. Sexual sadism became a form of patriotic duty. One surviving document from this period is a letter from a Roman father to his son, congratulating him on his sexual achievements. The father writes, "I am proud to hear that you have broken 3 slaves this month and that your creative use of the hot iron has impressed your friends. You are becoming a true Roman man." The son's response describes his techniques in detail, including methods of torture that were specifically designed to maximize psychological as well as physical suffering. He writes about his plans to break even more slaves and about his hopes of eventually moving on to free women. These weren't criminal conspiracies or secret societies. These were normal family communications between respectable Roman citizens. The systematic torture and sexual exploitation of human beings had become so normalized that parents were proud when their children excelled at it. But the emperors didn't just influence sexual culture through their personal behavior, they also shaped it through law, and some of the legal changes they made revealed just how thoroughly Roman society had abandoned any pretense of protecting the vulnerable. Emperor Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 AD, is often remembered as one of the more enlightened Roman rulers. He built Hadrian's Wall, promoted arts and culture, and traveled throughout the empire promoting Roman civilization. But Hadrian also passed some of the most brutal sexual laws in Roman history. Hadrian's legal code included provisions that made it legal for Roman citizens to sexually abuse anyone who wasn't a citizen. This included not just slaves, but also free people from conquered territories, refugees, and anyone who had lost their citizenship for any reason. The law was explicit about what was permitted. Roman citizens could rape, torture, mutilate, or kill non-citizens for sexual pleasure, and faced no legal consequences. The only restriction was that they couldn't interfere with someone else's property rights. But Hadrian went even further. He also legalized what he called sexual education for children. This law made it legal for Roman adults to sexually abuse children as young as 7 years old, as long as they claimed they were teaching them about adult responsibilities. The law included detailed descriptions of what kinds of sexual acts were considered educational and what kinds were considered excessive. But the line between education and abuse was drawn so broadly that almost any sexual act with a child could be justified as educational. Hadrian also created special schools where children would be trained specifically for sexual service. These schools were run by the government and attended by children who had been orphaned, abandoned, or sold by their families. The children would receive basic education in reading and writing, but their primary training was in sexual techniques. Graduates of these schools would be sold to wealthy Romans or placed in high-end brothels. The schools were so successful that they became a model for similar institutions throughout the empire. Within a few decades, every major Roman city had government-run schools for training child prostitutes. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Hadrian's law regarding sexual resistance. This law made it a crime for anyone to resist sexual advances from a Roman citizen. Not just slaves, but anyone. If a Roman citizen wanted to have sex with you, you were legally required to comply. The law included detailed penalties for sexual resistance. First-time offenders could be fined or flogged. Repeat offenders could be enslaved or executed. The law was so broad that even Roman wives could be prosecuted for refusing their husband's sexual demands. This law created a culture where sexual consent became literally meaningless. If you couldn't legally refuse, then your compliance couldn't be considered genuine consent. The Romans had created a legal system that institutionalized rape and called it civilization. But the impact of these laws wasn't just legal, it was psychological. When resistance becomes illegal, many people stop even thinking about resistance. They internalize their powerlessness so completely that they lose the ability to imagine freedom. We have surviving accounts from people who lived under these laws, and many of them describe a kind of psychological numbness. They write about learning to dissociate during sexual encounters, to mentally separate themselves from what was happening to their bodies. One account, from a woman who had been repeatedly raped under Hadrian's laws, describes her experience. "I learned to send my mind away when they came for me. I would think about birds flying, or flowers blooming, or anything but what was happening. After a while, it became so automatic that I could barely feel anything at all." This dissociation wasn't just a survival strategy, it was a form of psychological death. People were learning to kill parts of themselves in order to survive in a system that had made their suffering legal and normal. But the laws didn't just affect the direct victims, they also affected the perpetrators in ways that ultimately destroyed Roman society from within. When sexual violence becomes legal and expected, it changes the psychology of the people who commit it. Roman men who grew up under these laws often became incapable of experiencing genuine intimacy or love. They'd learned to see other people as objects to be used rather than as fellow human beings. They'd become so accustomed to taking what they wanted by force that they couldn't understand the concept of mutual desire. This emotional numbness spread throughout Roman society. Marriage became a purely transactional relationship. Parent-child relationships became based on power and control rather than love and nurturing. Friendship became impossible because everyone was potential prey or potential predator. The Romans had created a society where genuine human connection had become almost impossible. They'd traded their humanity for power, and in the process, they'd lost the ability to find meaning or joy in their lives. But let's talk about what this meant for the daily lives of ordinary Romans, because understanding how these laws and customs affected regular people helps us grasp the full horror of what we're dealing with here. If you were a Roman child growing up under these laws, your childhood would be fundamentally different from anything we can imagine today. You'd learn from an early age that your body didn't belong to you, that other people had the right to use you sexually, and that resistance was not only futile but illegal. Roman children were taught to submit to sexual advances from adults as a basic life skill, like learning to read or write. Parents would actually practice sexual techniques with their children, claiming they were preparing them for adult life. This wasn't considered abuse, it was considered good parenting. Children who resisted these lessons would be punished severely. They might be beaten, starved, or sold into slavery. The message was clear. Your only value is your ability to provide sexual pleasure to others, and if you can't or won't do that, you're worthless. By the time these children reached adulthood, many of them were so psychologically damaged that they couldn't function in normal relationships. They'd either become completely passive, unable to assert themselves in any situation, or they'd become sexually aggressive, imitating the behavior they'd been subjected to. This created a cycle of abuse that perpetuated itself across generations. Children who were sexually abused would grow up to sexually abuse their own children, not because they were inherently evil, but because they had no framework for understanding that relationships could be based on anything other than domination and submission. If you were a Roman woman living under these laws, your life would be a constant series of sexual violations that you'd be expected to endure with grace and dignity. You'd be raped by your husband, by his friends, by strangers on the street, and by government officials, and you'd be expected to thank them for the privilege. Roman women developed elaborate psychological defenses to cope with this reality. Some would become completely emotionally numb, shutting down all feelings to avoid the pain of constant violation. Others would become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats and trying to anticipate when they'd be attacked next. Many Roman women would develop what we'd now recognize as complex PTSD. They'd have nightmares, flashbacks, and panic attacks. They'd become unable to trust anyone or form healthy relationships. But they had no language to describe their suffering and no hope of getting help. The Romans interpreted these trauma symptoms as evidence of female weakness and inferiority. They used the psychological damage they'd inflicted as proof that women were naturally suited for submission and abuse. If you were a Roman slave, your situation was even worse. You'd be subjected to sexual abuse from multiple people every day, and you'd have no legal protection whatsoever. You'd be bought and sold specifically for sexual purposes, and your value would be determined entirely by your ability to satisfy your owner's desires. Roman slaves were often forced to perform sexual acts in public for the entertainment of free citizens. They'd be made to have sex with each other, with animals, or with objects while crowds watched and cheered. This wasn't considered cruel or unusual, it was considered normal entertainment. Slaves who became pregnant from these encounters would often have their children taken away and sold. The children would then be raised specifically for sexual exploitation, continuing the cycle of abuse into the next generation. But perhaps most tragically, many Roman slaves would eventually internalize their treatment so completely that they'd lose the ability to imagine freedom. They'd become so psychologically dependent on their abusers that they'd be unable to function if they were ever freed. We have accounts of Roman slaves who were offered freedom and refused it because they couldn't imagine surviving without their master's protection. They'd become so broken that they preferred familiar abuse to unknown freedom. This psychological dependence wasn't accidental. Roman slaveholders deliberately used sexual abuse as a method of psychological control. They understood that if they could break someone's spirit completely, they'd have a more compliant and valuable slave. The techniques they used were sophisticated and systematic. They'd alternate between extreme abuse and small kindnesses, creating a trauma bond that made the slave emotionally dependent on their abuser. They'd isolate slaves from each other to prevent them from forming supportive relationships. They'd use sexual humiliation to break down the slave's sense of self-worth. These techniques were so effective that they were studied and refined over generations. Roman texts on slave management include detailed instructions on how to use sexual abuse to maintain control. These weren't secret manuals or underground texts, they were standard reference works used by slave owners throughout the empire. But the impact of this system wasn't limited to the direct victims. It affected every aspect of Roman society, from the economy to politics to religion. When sexual exploitation becomes the foundation of your civilization, it warps everything else. The Roman economy, for example, was heavily dependent on sexual slavery. Brothels were major businesses that employed thousands of people and generated enormous profits. The sex trade was so important to Roman prosperity that economic downturns were often blamed on insufficient sexual exploitation. Roman politics was similarly warped by sexual dynamics. Political power was often measured by how many people you could sexually dominate. Political alliances were sealed through sexual arrangements. Political enemies were destroyed through sexual humiliation. Roman religion became increasingly focused on sexual violence. Gods were worshipped through sexual acts, often performed by slaves or children. Religious festivals became occasions for mass sexual abuse. Priests were expected to sexually dominate their followers as a demonstration of divine power. Even Roman art and literature became obsessed with sexual violence. Homes were decorated with images of rape and sexual torture. Popular literature celebrated sexual sadism and the suffering of victims. Theater performances often included real sexual violence, with slaves and condemned criminals being actually abused on stage for the entertainment of the audience. The Romans had created a total system of sexual exploitation that touched every aspect of their civilization. They'd built their entire culture around the systematic abuse of the powerless, and they'd convinced themselves that this was not only normal, but morally superior. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The Romans exported this system throughout their empire. As they conquered new territories, they didn't just impose their political and economic systems, they imposed their sexual culture as well. Local cultures that might have had different attitudes toward sexuality were systematically destroyed. Indigenous concepts of consent, sexual ethics, and human dignity were replaced with Roman practices. The Romans didn't just conquer territory, they conquered sexuality itself. We have evidence of this cultural transformation from across the empire. In Britain, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, archaeological evidence shows that Roman-style sexual practices were imposed on local populations. Native sexual customs were outlawed, and Roman practices were enforced through violence and legal coercion. The Romans created training programs for local elites, teaching them Roman sexual practices and expecting them to implement these practices in their own communities. They established Roman-style brothels in every major city. They imported Roman sexual slaves to serve as examples for local populations. Within a generation or two, the sexual cultures of conquered peoples had been completely transformed. Children who grew up under Roman rule often had no knowledge of their ancestors' sexual practices. They'd been completely assimilated into the Roman system of sexual exploitation. This cultural destruction was so thorough that in many cases, we have no record of what pre-Roman sexual practices looked like. The Romans didn't just conquer these cultures, they erased them from history. But the Romans didn't just spread their sexual practices through conquest. They also spread them through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Roman merchants would bring Roman sexual practices to the cities they visited. Roman diplomats would expect to be provided with sexual services as part of their official duties. Roman cultural exports, like literature and art, would normalize Roman sexual practices in foreign courts. Over time, Roman sexual culture became the dominant model throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Even societies that were never conquered by Rome began to adopt Roman practices because they were seen as sophisticated and civilized. The Romans had created a form of sexual imperialism that was even more effective than their military conquests. They'd convinced much of the known world that their system of sexual exploitation was not only acceptable but desirable. And this brings us to one of the most important questions we can ask about Roman sexuality. How did this system finally begin to change? Because it did change, eventually. The sexual culture of late Rome was very different from the sexual culture of early Rome, and understanding that transformation can teach us something about how societies can recover from moral collapse. The answer is complicated, but it involves several factors working together over centuries. The rise of Christianity played a role, but so did economic changes, military pressures, and the gradual development of new ideas about human dignity and rights. But perhaps most importantly, the Roman system of sexual exploitation eventually began to collapse under its own weight. A society that had made cruelty its foundation couldn't sustain itself indefinitely. The psychological damage, the economic costs, and the social instability created by systematic sexual abuse eventually became too great for the empire to bear. The Romans had created a monster, and eventually that monster destroyed them. But that's a story for our next installment, where we'll explore how Roman sexual culture evolved during the empire's decline, and how the seeds of its transformation were planted in the very contradictions of the system itself. For now, I want you to sit with what we've discussed today because it's a lot to process. We've explored how emperors shaped sexual culture, how laws institutionalized sexual violence, and how an entire civilization became organized around the systematic abuse of the powerless. This isn't just ancient history. These are patterns that we can see in different forms throughout human history, and understanding them can help us recognize when our own societies are heading down dangerous paths. The Romans show us how quickly a society can normalize the unthinkable, how easily exploitation can become institutionalized, and how difficult it is to recover once you've lost your moral foundation. But they also show us that change is possible. Even the most entrenched systems of oppression can eventually be transformed. It takes time, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our societies. And that's why we study this history. Not to judge the past, but to learn from it, not to feel superior to our ancestors, but to understand our own capacity for both good and evil, and not to despair about human nature, but to commit ourselves to building societies that protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. In our next installment, we'll explore how Roman sexual culture began to change during the empire's decline, how Christianity and other factors contributed to that transformation, and what lessons we can learn from Rome's eventual recognition that their system was unsustainable. We'll also look at some of the individual stories of resistance and survival, because even in the darkest periods of Roman history, there were people who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable. Their stories remind us that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can find ways to resist, and eventually triumph. So make sure you're subscribed and ready for the next part of this series, because we're going to dive even deeper into this complex and disturbing topic. And remember, understanding the darkness of the past is the first step toward ensuring it never happens again. The Romans thought they were building a civilization that would last forever. But in the end, their system of sexual exploitation became one of the primary reasons for their downfall. A society that had lost its ability to value human dignity was a society that had lost its ability to survive. And that's a lesson that every civilization, including our own, needs to remember. But the transformation of Roman sexual culture during the empire's decline reveals something even more disturbing about how deeply this system had penetrated the collective consciousness. As the empire began to crumble in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, you might expect that people would question the sexual practices that had helped bring about their downfall. Instead, many Romans doubled down on their exploitation, as if increasing their cruelty could somehow restore their lost power. The period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire fragment into competing factions, each trying to outdo the others in displays of sexual dominance. Military commanders would compete to see who could rape more civilians in conquered territories. Regional governors would establish increasingly elaborate systems of sexual tribute. Local officials would demand sexual services from citizens as payment for basic government services. What's truly chilling is that these practices were often justified as attempts to restore traditional Roman values. Leaders claimed that the empire had grown weak because Romans had become too soft, too compassionate, too willing to show mercy to the conquered. They argued that returning to the purer sexual practices of their ancestors would restore Rome's strength and glory. Emperor Maximinus Thrax, who ruled from 235 to 238 AD, issued what he called the Restoration Edict, which required all Roman citizens to participate in monthly sexual domination rituals. Citizens were required to publicly demonstrate their sexual prowess by abusing slaves, prostitutes, or captured enemies. Those who refused or showed insufficient enthusiasm could lose their citizenship or face execution. The edict included detailed descriptions of what kinds of sexual acts were considered sufficiently Roman and what kinds were considered evidence of foreign corruption. Citizens were encouraged to report neighbors who seemed reluctant to participate or who showed compassion toward their victims. One surviving account describes a public ceremony where hundreds of Roman citizens were required to sexually torture a group of captured Germanic prisoners. The ceremony lasted for days, with participants competing to devise the most creative forms of abuse. The account describes this as a glorious celebration of Roman virtue and praises the citizens' enthusiasm for traditional values. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Many of the participants weren't enjoying themselves. Surviving private letters from this period describe citizens who were sickened by what they were required to do, but who participated anyway out of fear. They'd created a system where everyone was forced to become a monster in order to survive. One letter from a Roman merchant to his brother describes his experience at one of these ceremonies. "I vomited twice during the ritual, but I forced myself to continue. If I had shown weakness, they would have turned on me next. I dream of their screams every night, but I dare not speak of it to anyone." The brother's response reveals the psychological toll this system was taking on ordinary Romans. "We are all damned now. We have become the very barbarians we once conquered, but there is no escape. We must continue this madness or be destroyed by it." These weren't isolated incidents. The entire empire had become trapped in a cycle of escalating sexual violence, where each generation tried to prove its Roman identity by being more cruel than the last. They'd created a system that demanded ever-increasing levels of brutality just to maintain the status quo. But the most disturbing aspect of this period was how the Romans began to sexualize their own decline. As the empire crumbled around them, many Romans began to eroticize destruction itself. They developed sexual practices that were specifically designed to mirror the chaos and violence of their collapsing civilization. The cult of Terminus, which emerged during this period, centered around sexual rituals that were meant to represent the end of the world. Followers would engage in increasingly extreme sexual practices, believing that by destroying themselves sexually, they could somehow control or prevent the destruction of their empire. These rituals often involved the deliberate mutilation of sexual organs, the consumption of human flesh during sexual acts, and the sacrifice of children in sexual ceremonies. The cult grew rapidly, attracting followers from all levels of Roman society, including senators, military commanders, and even some emperors. Emperor Heliogabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 AD, was a devoted follower of Terminus. He turned the imperial palace into a center for these extreme sexual rituals, forcing government officials to participate in ceremonies that combined sexual abuse with religious sacrifice. One surviving account describes a ceremony where Heliogabalus had dozens of children killed during sexual acts, claiming that their deaths would prevent the empire's collapse. The ceremony was attended by the most powerful people in Rome, who were required to participate in the sexual violence as a demonstration of their loyalty to the emperor. The account describes this as the most sacred duty of Roman citizenship and praises the participants for their willingness to sacrifice everything for the empire's survival. The complete inversion of moral values had become so total that Romans were praising themselves for committing acts that would have horrified their ancestors. But even as these extreme practices were being normalized, there were signs that the system was beginning to crack. The psychological toll of constant sexual violence was creating a generation of Romans who were incapable of functioning in normal society. Military discipline was breaking down because soldiers were too traumatized to follow orders. Economic production was declining because workers were too psychologically damaged to be productive. The empire was literally destroying itself from within through its own sexual practices. The very behaviors that Romans believed would restore their strength were actually making them weaker and more vulnerable to their enemies. And this is where we begin to see the first glimmers of change, not because Romans suddenly developed moral consciousness, but because their system of sexual exploitation had become so extreme that it was threatening their survival as a civilization. The rise of Christianity during this period wasn't just a religious revolution, it was also a response to the psychological trauma that Roman sexual culture had inflicted on its population. Early Christian communities offered something that had become almost impossible to find in Roman society: the possibility of human relationships based on love rather than domination. But the transition wasn't simple or straightforward. Many early Christians had grown up in the Roman system and carried its psychological scars with them. They struggled to understand concepts like consent, mutual respect, and emotional intimacy because these ideas were so foreign to their experience. Some early Christian communities actually developed sexual practices that were almost as extreme as Roman ones, but in the opposite direction. They would practice extreme sexual asceticism, believing that any sexual desire was evidence of Roman corruption. They would mutilate their own bodies to prevent sexual arousal or force themselves into marriages that were deliberately sexless and emotionally cold. These practices weren't healthy alternatives to Roman sexuality, they were trauma responses. People who had been so damaged by sexual violence that they couldn't imagine sexuality as anything other than abuse or complete abstinence. But gradually, over centuries, Christian communities began to develop new models of sexual relationships. They created the concept of marriage as a partnership between equals, rather than a relationship between master and property. They developed ideas about consent, about the importance of emotional connection, and about sexuality as an expression of love rather than domination. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't complete. Many aspects of Roman sexual culture survived in Christian communities for centuries. But the basic framework began to shift from exploitation to partnership, from domination to mutual respect. The transformation was also driven by practical necessity. As the Roman Empire collapsed, communities needed to find new ways to organize themselves that didn't depend on the systematic abuse of the powerless. They needed to create social bonds based on cooperation rather than fear. Communities that continued to practice Roman-style sexual exploitation found themselves unable to maintain social cohesion. They would fragment into competing factions, each trying to sexually dominate the others. They would lose the ability to cooperate on basic survival tasks like food production, defense, and child rearing. Meanwhile, communities that began to develop more egalitarian sexual practices found themselves more stable and successful. They could maintain social bonds even under stress. They could cooperate effectively on complex tasks. They could attract and retain members who might otherwise flee to more welcoming communities. Over time, these practical advantages became so obvious that even people who weren't motivated by moral concerns began to adopt less exploitative sexual practices. They discovered that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally superior, it was also more effective for building sustainable communities. But the transformation was incomplete and uneven. Many aspects of Roman sexual culture survived in modified forms. The idea that men should be sexually dominant persisted in Christian communities, just with new justifications. The sexual exploitation of the powerless continued, but it was hidden rather than celebrated. The psychological damage inflicted by centuries of sexual violence didn't disappear overnight. It took generations for people to learn how to form healthy relationships, how to trust each other, and how to experience sexuality as something other than a power struggle. And in many ways, we're still dealing with the legacy of Roman sexual culture today. The idea that sexuality is primarily about power rather than connection, that some people exist for others' sexual pleasure, that sexual violence is natural and inevitable. These ideas didn't disappear with the fall of Rome. They evolved, adapted, and found new forms of expression in every subsequent civilization. The specific practices changed, but the underlying logic of sexual exploitation proved remarkably persistent. Understanding this history helps us recognize how these patterns continue to influence our own world. When we see sexual exploitation being normalized or justified, when we see people being treated as objects rather than human beings, when we see power being used to coerce sexual compliance, we're seeing echoes of the Roman system, but we're also seeing something else, the possibility of resistance and transformation. Because if the Romans could eventually recognize that their system was unsustainable, if they could begin to develop alternatives even in the midst of their empire's collapse, then change is always possible. The Romans show us both how far human societies can fall and how they can begin to climb back up. They remind us that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, is permanent. They teach us that even the most damaged people can learn to heal, and that even the most corrupt societies can find their way back to humanity. But they also warn us about how easily progress can be reversed. The Romans had moments of moral clarity, periods when they seemed to be moving toward more humane practices. But they also had moments of moral regression, when they retreated into even more extreme forms of exploitation. The lesson is that moral progress isn't inevitable. It requires constant vigilance, constant effort, and constant willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our societies. It requires us to recognize that we're always capable of becoming monsters if we stop paying attention to the consequences of our actions. And that's why this history matters. Not because we're likely to become exactly like the Romans, but because we're always in danger of repeating their mistakes in new forms. Understanding how they lost their way can help us avoid losing ours. The Romans thought they were building a civilization that would last forever. They believed their sexual practices were evidence of their sophistication and superiority. They convinced themselves that their exploitation of the powerless was natural, inevitable, and morally justified. But in the end, their system of sexual exploitation became one of the primary reasons for their downfall. They created a society so psychologically damaged, so morally corrupted, so incapable of genuine human connection, that it couldn't sustain itself. The marble columns crumbled, the golden eagles fell, and the empire that had once dominated the known world disappeared into history. But the lessons of their rise and fall remain with us, waiting to be learned by anyone wise enough to listen. In our final installment of this series, we'll explore what happened to Roman sexual culture after the empire's collapse, how different regions of the former empire developed their own approaches to sexuality, and what lessons we can draw from this history for our own time. We'll also look at some of the archaeological evidence that continues to emerge, giving us new insights into what life was really like for ordinary people caught up in this system. Because the story of Roman sexuality isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion, and choosing which path we want to follow. The Romans made their choice, and it led them to destruction, but every generation gets to make that choice anew. Understanding their story can help us make better choices for ourselves and for the people who will come after us. Because in the end, that's what history is really about. Not just understanding what happened, but understanding what's possible. Not just learning about the past, but learning how to build a better future. The Romans showed us how low human civilization can sink when it loses its moral compass. But they also showed us that even in the darkest times, the possibility of redemption remains. We just have to be brave enough to choose it. So join us for the final part of this journey as we explore how the story of Roman sexuality finally ends. Not with conquest or glory, but with the slow, difficult work of learning to be human again. It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a part to play in how it turns out. The choice, as always, is ours. The final collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, around 476 AD, didn't end the story of Roman sexual culture. Instead, it scattered those practices across Europe and the Mediterranean, where they would evolve, adapt, and influence human sexuality for centuries to come. What happened next reveals both the persistence of these patterns and the possibility of genuine transformation. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's fall, different regions of the former empire developed radically different approaches to sexuality. Some areas doubled down on the most extreme Roman practices, as if clinging to sexual violence could somehow restore their lost glory. Others began experimenting with entirely new models of human relationships. The Byzantine Empire, which considered itself the continuation of Rome, initially maintained many of the old sexual practices. Byzantine emperors continued to keep vast harems of slaves and children. The imperial court remained a center of sexual exploitation and political manipulation through sexual means. But something interesting began to happen in Byzantium around the 6th century. Emperor Justinian, influenced by his wife Theodora, began to reform some of the most extreme sexual laws. Theodora herself had been a prostitute before becoming empress, and she understood the human cost of sexual exploitation in ways that few rulers ever had. Theodora convinced Justinian to pass laws that gave women some protection from sexual violence, that limited the sexual use of children, and that provided some legal recourse for victims of sexual abuse. These weren't revolutionary changes, but they represented the first time in centuries that Roman law had moved toward protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. The changes were modest and often poorly enforced, but they established a precedent that would influence legal development for centuries. The idea that even emperors had limits on their sexual behavior, that some people deserved protection from sexual violence, began to take root in Byzantine law. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, the various barbarian kingdoms that had replaced Roman rule were developing their own approaches to sexuality. Some, like the Visigoths in Spain, maintained Roman-style sexual practices almost unchanged. Others, like the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, developed hybrid systems that combined Roman exploitation with their own tribal customs. But the most interesting developments were happening in the areas where Roman rule had been weakest. In Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Germany, communities that had never been fully Romanized began to develop sexual practices that were radically different from anything the Romans had known. These communities often had more egalitarian relationships between men and women. They had stronger protections for children. They had concepts of consent that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed in Roman law. They weren't perfect societies, but they showed that alternatives to Roman sexual culture were possible. The spread of Christianity played a crucial role in these developments, but not in the way most people imagine. Early Christian communities weren't uniformly opposed to sexual pleasure or sexual expression. Instead, they were primarily concerned with ending sexual exploitation and violence. Christian monasteries became centers for developing new ideas about human relationships. Monks and nuns living in communities that were supposed to be celibate actually spent a lot of time thinking about sexuality and how it should be organized in a just society. Many of the Christian thinkers who shaped medieval sexual ethics were people who had grown up in the Roman system and understood its psychological costs. They weren't trying to eliminate sexuality, they were trying to heal the damage that Roman sexual culture had inflicted on human relationships. St. Augustine, for example, wrote extensively about sexuality and marriage. His ideas were heavily influenced by his own experience growing up in a Roman household where sexual exploitation was normal. He understood that the Roman system had made genuine love and intimacy almost impossible, and he tried to develop alternatives. Augustine's writings on marriage emphasized mutual consent, emotional connection, and the importance of treating one's partner as a fellow human being rather than as property. These ideas seem obvious to us now, but they were revolutionary at the time. Other Christian thinkers developed similar ideas. They created the concept of marriage as a sacrament, a holy bond between equals. They developed ideas about sexual ethics that emphasized love, commitment, and mutual respect. They created legal frameworks that gave women some protection from sexual violence. These changes happened slowly and unevenly. Many Christian communities continued to practice forms of sexual exploitation that weren't very different from Roman ones. The sexual abuse of children by clergy, for example, was a persistent problem that the church struggled to address. But the basic framework was shifting. The idea that sexuality should be about love rather than domination, that all people deserve dignity and respect, that consent mattered, these ideas began to take root in Christian communities across Europe. The transformation was also driven by practical considerations. As European societies became more settled and stable, they needed to develop social institutions that could function without constant violence and exploitation. Communities that continued to practice Roman-style sexual abuse found themselves unable to maintain social cohesion. Marriage, for example, became increasingly important as a way of organizing society and transferring property. But marriages based on sexual exploitation and domination were unstable and often produced children who were psychologically damaged and unable to function effectively as adults. Communities that developed more egalitarian marriage practices found themselves more successful. Their children were healthier and more capable. Their social bonds were stronger. Their economic production was more efficient. Over time, these practical advantages became so obvious that even people who weren't motivated by moral concerns began to adopt less exploitative practices. The medieval period saw the gradual development of new sexual norms that were very different from Roman ones. The ideal of courtly love, for example, emphasized emotional connection and mutual respect between men and women. The development of chivalric codes created expectations that men should protect women rather than exploit them. These changes weren't complete or universal. Medieval Europe was still a violent and often brutal place. Sexual exploitation continued in many forms. Women and children were still vulnerable to abuse. But the basic framework had shifted away from the systematic exploitation that had characterized Roman culture. The most important change was the development of the concept of individual consent. Roman law had recognized only property rights. A person's sexual autonomy mattered only insofar as it affected their owner's interests. Medieval law began to recognize that individuals had rights over their own bodies that couldn't be violated even by their social superiors. This was a revolutionary idea that took centuries to fully develop, but it represented a fundamental shift in how human sexuality was understood. Instead of being primarily about power and domination, sexuality began to be seen as something that should involve mutual agreement and respect. The transformation wasn't just legal and social, it was also psychological. People who grew up in medieval communities often had very different attitudes toward sexuality than their Roman predecessors. They were more likely to see sexual relationships as partnerships rather than contests for dominance. This psychological shift was crucial because it meant that people were less likely to accept sexual exploitation as natural or inevitable. They were more likely to resist abuse, to protect victims, and to seek alternatives to violence and domination. Archaeological evidence from medieval sites shows clear differences from Roman-era practices. Medieval communities had fewer brothels and less evidence of systematic sexual exploitation. They had more evidence of stable family relationships and less evidence of the psychological trauma that had characterized Roman sexual culture. Medieval art and literature also reflected these changes. Instead of celebrating sexual violence and domination, medieval culture increasingly emphasized love, commitment, and mutual respect. The stories people told about sexuality were different, and so were the values they transmitted to their children. But perhaps the most important change was the development of new ideas about human dignity and worth. The Roman system had been based on the assumption that some people were naturally superior to others and had the right to exploit them. Medieval culture, influenced by Christian ideas about the inherent worth of all human beings, began to challenge these assumptions. This didn't mean that medieval society was egalitarian or that exploitation disappeared, but it did mean that exploitation had to be justified rather than simply assumed. People began to develop moral frameworks that could be used to critique and resist sexual violence. The legacy of Roman sexual culture didn't disappear overnight. Many of its patterns persisted in modified forms throughout the medieval period and beyond. The idea that men should be sexually dominant, that women and children were vulnerable to exploitation, that sexuality was primarily about power. These ideas continued to influence human relationships for centuries. But the basic framework had shifted. Instead of a system based on systematic exploitation, medieval Europe began to develop systems based on mutual consent and respect. Instead of celebrating sexual violence, medieval culture increasingly condemned it. Instead of treating people as objects, medieval law began to recognize individual rights and dignity. The transformation was incomplete and uneven. Different regions developed different approaches. Some communities made more progress than others. Many aspects of Roman sexual culture survived in hidden or modified forms. But the direction of change was clear. Human sexuality was slowly being transformed from a system of exploitation into something that could be based on love, respect, and mutual consent. It was a process that would continue for centuries and that is still ongoing today. The story of Roman sexuality and its aftermath teaches us several important lessons. First, it shows us how quickly human societies can normalize even the most extreme forms of exploitation. The Romans didn't start out as monsters, they gradually developed practices that would have horrified their ancestors. Second, it shows us that no system of oppression, no matter how entrenched, is permanent. Even the most brutal practices can be challenged and eventually transformed. The Romans believed their sexual culture was natural and inevitable, but it proved to be neither. Third, it shows us that change is possible but not inevitable. The transformation of Roman sexual culture took centuries and required the efforts of countless individuals who were willing to challenge established norms and develop alternatives. Fourth, it shows us that psychological healing is possible even after extreme trauma. The people who lived through the Roman system were deeply damaged, but they and their descendants were able to develop healthier ways of relating to each other. Finally, it shows us that our own sexual culture is not fixed or inevitable. The way we organize human sexuality in our own time is the result of historical processes that could have gone differently and that can still be changed. Understanding this history helps us recognize both the progress we've made and the work that still needs to be done. We live in a world where sexual exploitation still exists, where consent is still contested, where power is still used to coerce sexual compliance. But we also live in a world where these practices are increasingly recognized as wrong and where alternatives are being developed. The Romans show us what happens when a society loses its moral compass and begins to treat sexuality as primarily about power and domination. But they also show us that even the most damaged societies can begin to heal if they're willing to confront their failures and develop alternatives. The choice, as always, is ours. We can continue to repeat the patterns of the past, or we can work to build something better. We can accept exploitation as inevitable, or we can commit ourselves to creating relationships based on love, respect, and mutual consent. The Romans made their choice, and it led them to destruction, but every generation gets to make that choice anew. Understanding their story can help us make better choices for ourselves and for the people who will come after us. Because in the end, that's what history is really about. Not just understanding what happened, but understanding what's possible. Not just learning about the past, but learning how to build a better future. The transformation of Roman sexual culture from systematic exploitation to something approaching human dignity took centuries and cost countless lives. But it happened. And if it could happen then, in a world without modern communication, education, or legal protections, it can happen again. The story of Roman sexuality is ultimately a story about human choices, about the capacity for both cruelty and compassion that exists within every society, about the possibility of redemption even in the darkest times, about the slow, difficult work of learning to treat each other with dignity and respect. It's a story that's still being written, and we all have a part to play in how it turns out. The Romans didn't just shape sexuality through law and culture, they created what we might call the world's first systematic approach to sexual education, though what they taught would horrify any modern parent. Roman children weren't shielded from sexuality, they were deliberately exposed to it from the earliest possible age as part of their social conditioning. If you were a Roman child, your sexual education began around age 5 or 6, not through gentle conversations about the birds and the bees, but through direct observation of adult sexual behavior. Roman homes didn't have the privacy we take for granted today. Sexual acts happened in full view of children, slaves, and other household members. This wasn't considered inappropriate, it was considered educational. Roman parents believed that children needed to understand sexual hierarchy from an early age. Boys were taught that they would grow up to be sexual dominators, that their worth as men would be measured by their ability to sexually control others. Girls were taught that they would be sexually controlled, that their value lay in their ability to satisfy male desires without complaint. The methods they used to teach these lessons were systematic and deliberate. Roman boys were given young slaves to practice on, learning techniques of sexual domination that they would use throughout their lives. They were taught to see sexual pleasure as something they took from others, not something they shared with them. Roman girls were subjected to what the Romans called preparation rituals that were designed to break down their resistance to sexual submission. These rituals often involved forms of sexual abuse that were justified as necessary training for adult life. The girls were taught to dissociate from their own bodies, to see themselves as objects existing for others' pleasure. But the Romans didn't just teach sexual techniques, they taught sexual psychology. Children were systematically conditioned to accept the power dynamics that defined Roman sexual culture. They learned to see domination and submission as natural, inevitable, and morally correct. Roman educational texts that have survived provide chilling insights into how this conditioning worked. One text, used in schools throughout the empire, includes detailed instructions for teachers on how to break down children's natural empathy and teach them to enjoy others' suffering. The text explains that children naturally feel distress when they see others in pain, and that this natural compassion must be systematically eliminated if they are to function effectively in Roman society. Teachers were instructed to force children to watch sexual violence and to punish them if they showed signs of distress or sympathy for the victims. Over time, children would learn to suppress their natural empathy and eventually to find pleasure in others' pain. This wasn't considered cruel, it was considered necessary preparation for adult life in a society based on systematic exploitation. The psychological techniques the Romans used were remarkably sophisticated. They understood that breaking down empathy required more than just exposure to violence. It required active participation in that violence, so that children would become complicit in the system they were being taught to perpetuate. Roman schools included regular exercises where children were required to abuse slaves or prisoners. These exercises were graded like any other academic activity, with children receiving praise for creativity and enthusiasm in their abuse of others. One surviving school record shows a class of 8-year-old children being taught different methods of sexual torture. The record includes detailed descriptions of the techniques they learned and evaluations of their performance. The teacher's comments praised students who showed natural aptitude for domination and expressed concern about those who seemed too sympathetic to their subjects. These weren't isolated incidents or extreme examples. This was standard educational practice throughout the Roman Empire. Every Roman child, regardless of social class, was systematically trained to participate in sexual exploitation. The long-term psychological effects of this conditioning were exactly what the Romans intended. Adults who had been raised in the system often found it literally impossible to conceive of sexual relationships based on mutual respect and affection. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to see sexuality as a power struggle that they couldn't imagine any other way of relating to others. Roman literature is filled with accounts of people who tried to form loving relationships but found themselves unable to do so. They would describe feeling confused or disgusted by the idea of sexual equality, of being unable to experience pleasure without dominating someone else. One Roman writer, Pliny the Younger, wrote about his struggle to understand his wife's desire for emotional intimacy. He describes feeling unnatural revulsion at the idea of treating her as an equal partner and his confusion at her requests for affection and respect. Pliny's letters reveal a man who was genuinely trying to be a good husband by Roman standards, but who had been so damaged by his upbringing that he couldn't understand what his wife needed from him. He could only relate to her as a superior to a subordinate, and he was baffled by her unhappiness with this arrangement. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman sexual education was how it created intergenerational trauma that persisted for centuries. Children who were abused in the Roman system grew up to abuse their own children, not because they were inherently evil, but because they had no framework for understanding that relationships could be based on anything other than domination and submission. Archaeological evidence from Roman sites shows clear patterns of this intergenerational trauma. Skeletal remains of children show evidence of systematic abuse that was passed down through families for generations. Burial practices reveal that children were often killed when they became too damaged to be useful, and that this was considered normal household management. The Romans had created a system of sexual education that was designed to perpetuate itself indefinitely. Each generation would be more thoroughly conditioned than the last, more completely cut off from their natural empathy, more perfectly adapted to a world of systematic exploitation. But the system also contained the seeds of its own destruction, because a society that systematically destroys empathy in its children is a society that eventually loses the ability to function cooperatively. The Romans discovered this during their later imperial period when they found themselves increasingly unable to maintain social cohesion or effective governance. Roman military effectiveness declined as soldiers became too psychologically damaged to follow orders or work together effectively. Economic productivity fell as workers became too traumatized to perform complex tasks. Even basic family relationships became increasingly unstable as people lost the ability to form genuine emotional bonds. The empire that had once conquered the known world began to fragment and collapse, not primarily due to external pressures, but due to the internal psychological damage that their sexual culture had inflicted on their own people. This brings us to one of the most important lessons of Roman sexuality. The idea that systematic cruelty can be sustained indefinitely is an illusion. Eventually, the psychological damage becomes so severe that the system destroys itself. The Romans thought they were creating a civilization that would last forever by building it on a foundation of sexual domination. Instead, they created a civilization that was doomed to collapse because it had systematically destroyed the human capacity for cooperation, empathy, and genuine connection. But understanding this history isn't just about learning from the Romans' mistakes. It's about recognizing how these patterns continue to influence our own world. Because the Roman approach to sexual education didn't disappear with the fall of the empire. It evolved, adapted, and found new forms of expression in every subsequent civilization. When we see children being exposed to sexual violence as education, when we see young people being taught that sexuality is primarily about power and domination, when we see empathy being systematically discouraged in favor of competitive cruelty, we're seeing echoes of the Roman system. The specific practices may be different, but the underlying logic is the same. The idea that children must be broken down and rebuilt according to adult desires, that natural empathy is a weakness to be eliminated, that sexuality is a tool of social control rather than an expression of human connection. Understanding the Roman example helps us recognize these patterns and resist them. It shows us what happens when societies lose sight of children's fundamental humanity and begin to treat them as objects to be shaped according to adult agendas. The Romans believed they were preparing their children for the real world by teaching them to be cruel and exploitative. But they were actually preparing them for a world that couldn't sustain itself because it had lost the capacity for genuine human relationship. The collapse of Roman civilization wasn't just a political or military failure. It was a psychological and moral failure that had its roots in how they treated their most vulnerable members. A society that systematically abuses its children is a society that has chosen to destroy its own future. And that's why this history matters today. Not because we're likely to replicate Roman practices exactly, but because we're always in danger of falling into similar patterns of treating children as objects, rather than as human beings deserving of protection and respect. The Romans show us both how far human cruelty can go, and how it ultimately destroys the very people who practice it. They remind us that protecting children isn't just about kindness or morality, it's about survival. A civilization that fails to protect its most vulnerable members is a civilization that has chosen to die. But they also show us that change is possible. Even the most entrenched systems of abuse can be challenged and eventually transformed. The medieval period saw the gradual development of new ideas about childhood, about education, and about human dignity that represented a fundamental break with Roman practices. These changes didn't happen overnight, and they weren't complete, but they show us that human societies can learn from their mistakes and develop better ways of treating each other. The story of Roman sexuality is ultimately a story about choices, about the kind of society we want to create and the kind of people we want to be. The Romans made their choices, and those choices led them to destruction. But every generation gets to make those choices anew. Understanding their story can help us make better choices for ourselves and for the children who will inherit the world we create. Because in the end, that's what history is really about. Not just understanding what happened, but understanding what's possible. Not just learning about the past, but learning how to build a better future. The Romans thought they were building a civilization that would last forever, but they built it on a foundation of systematic cruelty that ultimately consumed them. We have the opportunity to build something different, something based on respect, compassion, and genuine human connection. The choice, as always, is ours. As we reach the end of our journey through the brutal realities of Roman sexuality, it's important to remember that this isn't just ancient history. These patterns of exploitation, domination, and systematic abuse have echoes that reverberate through time, appearing in different forms across cultures and centuries. The Romans created a template for how societies can normalize the unthinkable, how they can build entire civilizations on the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable, and how they can convince themselves that their cruelty is actually virtue. But they also showed us the ultimate cost of such choices. Their empire, built on marble and gold, on military might and cultural sophistication, ultimately crumbled because it had rotted from within. A society that had lost its capacity for genuine human connection, that had systematically destroyed empathy and compassion, that had turned sexuality into a weapon of domination rather than an expression of love, was a society that couldn't sustain itself. The psychological damage they inflicted on their own people became so severe that they lost the ability to function as a coherent civilization. The very practices they believed made them strong ultimately made them weak, fragmented, and vulnerable to collapse. But the story doesn't end with Rome's fall. It continues in every society that faces the choice between protecting the vulnerable and exploiting them, between building relationships based on mutual respect and building them on domination and submission, between teaching children to be compassionate and teaching them to be cruel. We've seen how these patterns can persist across generations, how they can be rationalized and justified, how they can become so normalized that people stop seeing them as choices at all. But we've also seen that change is possible, that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged and transformed. The medieval period's gradual development of new ideas about human dignity, about consent, about the value of every individual life, shows us that societies can learn from their mistakes and choose different paths. The process is slow, difficult, and often incomplete, but it's possible. And that's the real lesson of Roman sexuality. Not that humans are inevitably cruel or that exploitation is natural and inevitable, but that we always have choices. We can choose to build societies that protect the vulnerable or ones that exploit them. We can choose to teach our children compassion or cruelty. We can choose to use our power to heal or to harm. The Romans made their choices, and we've seen where those choices led. Now it's our turn to choose. The patterns they established are still with us, still influencing how we think about sexuality, power, and human relationships. But we have the opportunity to choose differently. We can choose to build societies based on consent rather than coercion, on mutual respect rather than domination, on love rather than exploitation. We can choose to protect children rather than abuse them, to heal trauma rather than perpetuate it, to create connection rather than destroy it. The choice isn't always easy. The Roman patterns are deeply embedded in our culture and our psychology. But understanding this history gives us the tools to recognize these patterns and resist them. It shows us what's at stake when we fail to protect the vulnerable, and it reminds us that the costs of such failure are ultimately borne by everyone. The Romans thought they were building a civilization that would last forever, but they built it on a foundation that couldn't sustain itself. We have the opportunity to build something different, something that can endure because it's based on the best of human nature rather than the worst. The story of Roman sexuality is a warning about what happens when societies lose their moral compass. But it's also a reminder that we always have the power to choose a different path. The question isn't whether we're capable of cruelty or compassion, we're capable of both. The question is which one we choose to cultivate. As we close this exploration into one of history's darkest chapters, remember that understanding the past isn't just about satisfying curiosity, it's about learning how to build a better future. The Romans show us both the depths to which human societies can sink and the heights to which they can rise. The choice, as it always has been, is ours. If you found this deep dive into Roman sexuality as disturbing and enlightening as I hope you did, make sure you're subscribed for more unflinching looks at history's most challenging topics. And let me know in the comments what other dark corners of the past you'd like us to explore together, because understanding where we've been is the first step toward deciding where we want to go. And that's a journey we're all taking together, whether we realize it or not. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that the past doesn't have to be prologue. We get to write the next chapter, and it's up to us to make it better than the last.